Hello, so thank you so much for tuning into this presentation. My name is Kate Freeman Anderson, and I'm in the Sociology Department at the University of Houston. I also have two co-authors on this piece, Joe Galaskiewicz and Kendra Thompson-Dyck, both sociologists from the University of Arizona. So generally with this study, we aim to examine racial and ethnic residential segregation and how that's related to job accessibility by public transportation and income outcomes across the US. We're going to take this study in two pieces, and we have two research questions to go along with this. First, how is racial residential segregation related to job accessibility by public transportation networks? And second, how does job accessibility by public transportation networks moderate the relationship between racial residential segregation and income? So first, we'll examine how segregation is related to job accessibility by public transportation networks, and then we'll see if this relates to incomes across block groups in the 50 largest metropolitan areas in the US. Theoretically, this research is grounded in the spatial mismatch hypothesis tradition. This was first hypothesized by the economist Keynes in his seminal work in 1968. Without getting into all the nuances of the argument or the various ways that this has played out empirically over the years, generally the hypothesis is that jobs are not located physically near poor and minority neighborhoods, even those jobs which are for low-skilled and low-wage workers. And the argument is that this could help account for other aspects of racial inequality in the US, such as the unemployment rate and income inequality. Other work after Keynes' original hypothesis has demonstrated this to be empirically the case in a variety of different contexts. So what we're trying to tackle with this study in particular is how we could alleviate or contend with the spatial mismatch hypothesis by understanding it through taking into account public transportation networks. In theory, the spatial mismatch doesn't need to be a huge problem as long as people are able to move effectively and efficiently throughout the metropolitan area in order to access their needed jobs. So we examine how segregation is related to accessibility through public transportation in particular as one potential solution to this problem. And we examine how these patterns then relate to incomes across areas. As a side note, we also, as part of the broader study here, we examined the unemployment rate across areas, but for the sake of keeping things shorter for this presentation, we're only going to present the results for income today. But the patterns are basically the same in the case of unemployment. More theoretically, especially from the planning perspective, many people have argued that public transportation could be a solution to this problem, more so than other means of transportation. The theory of public transportation is that it should be accessible to all, is much cheaper than private transportation, such as owning a private vehicle or using a car service or taxi. And also because of the public nature of public transit, in theory, the transportation network should be a resource that is much more egalitarian in nature. So we're referring to this as the public good perspective on public transportation. However, there's a flip side to this perspective that has a much more critical take on what's going on with public transportation. And this is rooted in critical race theory and the place stratification perspective in urban sociology that would argue that despite the public orientation of public transportation, it is a man-made system that has the same institutional racism built into it as in other aspects of and institutions in social life. So the transportation network is built in a particular way that responds to public pressures and demands in a way that might favor white and more affluent neighborhoods by placing transit network lines, and especially more desirable lines like rail transit, in more advantaged or whiter neighborhoods. And some research has empirically demonstrated this to be the case. So in the case of driving transportation systems, the hub and spoke networks that we see in a lot of cities, especially larger cities, that those designs tend to favor suburban white neighborhoods, and in some cases have even carved up historically minority neighborhoods. Other work on public transportation has shown that more desirable lines, so more efficient rail systems and things like that, are more likely to run through whiter and more affluent areas of certain cities, or that white and affluent ridership is encouraged on those lines. And then similarly, other work has shown that the location of key public transportation network lines has also increased home values in those areas, which also pushes out those less affluent members of those neighborhoods. So even though it's a public good, it may ultimately serve to benefit white and affluent neighborhoods more. With this study, we're going to attempt to adjudicate between these two theoretical perspectives in a study of neighborhoods at the block group level and how they're connected to jobs. So we present two pairs of matched hypotheses for each of the research questions above that reflect the two theoretical perspectives. So first, looking at job accessibility by the public transportation network as the outcome, the first hypothesis from the public goods perspective is that racial residential segregation will be unrelated to job accessibility by public transportation, meaning that we wouldn't expect segregation and job accessibility to be meaningfully related because the transit network should be serving all areas equally, or at least on the basis of population density and not racial dynamics. And then from the place stratification perspective, the second hypothesis is that racial residential segregation will be negatively related to job accessibility by public transportation, meaning that because public transportation network lines may disproportionately benefit certain areas over others, we expect that segregation will be related to fewer available jobs that are accessible through public transit. For the second research question on how this relates to outcomes, we have two more hypotheses. First, from the public goods perspective, since other research has shown substantial differences in income by segregation, we expect that this public good will provide better access to job opportunities and would alleviate differences between areas in terms of economic outcomes. So we get hypothesis 3, that job accessibility by public transportation will lessen the relationship between racial residential segregation and income. And the flip side of this from the place stratification perspective, which would see this as yet another instance of where inequalities in income can be exacerbated, we expect the following hypothesis 4, that job accessibility by public transportation will strengthen the relationship between racial residential segregation and income. So getting to our actual study, we used two main data sources to study these associations. We used the 2017 Access Across America Transit Study, which comes from the University of Minnesota Center for Transportation Studies Accessibility Observatory. This data source calculated accessibility scores at the block group level for each block in the 50 largest metropolitan areas in the US. They used information about the public transportation network's time of day and congestion to produce estimates of how many jobs a person living at a particular block could access within 30 minutes commute time. We then paired this with sociodemographic data from the 2013-2017 American Community Survey at the block group level. We have two dependent variables. Like I just mentioned, the first dependent variable comes from the UNMN transit data on the number of jobs accessible by the public transportation network within 30 minutes. One thing to note is that we took these figures across the blocks and then averaged them to the block group level. There was a lot of missing census data and the margins of error were a lot higher at the block level. So in order to better match it to the census figures, we combined them in this fashion. And then the second dependent variable for the second part was median household income of the block group. We wanted to break this out by racial group originally, but there was way too much missing data when divided by race, so that wasn't really feasible. But in highly segregated areas, these numbers would be somewhat conflated, and then less so in integrated areas. Our main independent variables were a pair of segregation scores, which are also measured at the block group from the census data. I won't spend too much time on the measurement of this, but generally it's a way to calculate segregation at a small unit of analysis beyond ethnic composition, which would just be the percent of a group in an area, in a way that takes into account both concentration and clustering. So you can see the formula there. It's basically just the percent of a group in an area multiplied by the average percent of that group and its neighbors, with a neighbor defined by a Queen contiguity matrix. And we calculate this for both Black and Latino clustering. And we also group mean centered these scores to the county, because in some areas, especially thinking about Latinos in border states, those areas simply have higher numbers for certain groups, and we don't want that to be the point of comparison. We also control for population density, which is a pretty important control because we can reasonably assume that it would be fair for more densely populated areas to have more jobs. And then in the first analysis, we also control for percent in poverty at the block group and percent college educated or higher. We don't use these in the second set of models because they're just far too correlated with the outcome of income. For the modeling strategy, we estimate a series of spatial error models to account for significant spatial autocorrelation. This was shown to be the most appropriate model using the Lagrange multiplier statistics, and we used a K5 nearest neighbor spatial weight matrix, as that was shown to best maximize global Moran's I. We also include robust standard errors due to significant heteroscedasticity. So here are the results for part 1, the first research question on how racial residential segregation is related to job accessibility by public transportation. And what we find very briefly is that both Black and Latino clustering are negatively related to the outcome, meaning that the higher the concentration and clustering of both Black and Latinos across block groups, the fewer the jobs that are accessible by public transportation for them. And this remains the case even after controlling for socioeconomic dynamics in the way of percent in poverty and percent college educated. Then we have the set of models for the second research question for whether or not this relates to income across areas, and we build these models in a stepwise fashion. So first we included just segregation, and for both Black and Latino segregation, they are significantly negatively related to median household income, meaning that the higher the degree of concentration and clustering of Blacks and Latinos in a block group, the lower the median household income. In the next set of models, the next columns, we added the variable for job accessibility by the public transportation network, and we can see that it has an independent relationship to income. In this case, it is positive, though, meaning that the more job accessibility by public transit in an area, the higher the incomes at the block group. And finally, in these last columns, we added the interaction term between job accessibility by the public transit network and the two segregation scores. In both cases, the interaction term is negative, meaning that it strengthens the negative coefficient for segregation. Okay, personally, I find looking at the coefficient for the interaction term to be a little bit confusing, so I would rather look at it in graph form. And this is what that looks like, and I think it makes a lot more sense this way. So along the x-axis is Black clustering, and I basically just plugged in some key values to generate predicted values and then graph the line. So on the bottom here is one standard deviation below the mean, and one standard deviation above the mean for Black clustering. And the lines are organized in a similar fashion. The orange line is the mean level of job accessibility by public transportation. The blue is one standard deviation below, and the gray is one standard deviation above the mean. What we can readily see is that first, as Black clustering increases, median household income goes down, but then the slope of this line is different for the different levels of job accessibility by public transit. The line is actually flatter where job accessibility by public transit is worse, and it's steeper where job accessibility by public transportation is better, indicating that it actually exacerbates the association between segregation and income. So Black clustered block groups appear to be benefiting less from the transit network in terms of their incomes. We see the same pattern for Latino clustering, though it's somewhat less stark. But again, as Latino clustering increases, median household income goes down, and the line is flatter where job accessibility by public transit is worse, and it's steeper where job accessibility by public transit is better. So again, we find that negative moderating effect of the public transportation network. Circling this back to the theory and hypotheses from the beginning, we find support for hypotheses 2 and 4. Hypothesis 2 predicted that minority segregated areas would have less accessibility to jobs via the public transportation network, and we found this to be the case for both Black and Latino clustering. And hypothesis 4 predicted that job accessibility would moderate the relationship between segregation and income, such that it would exacerbate income inequalities across areas. So in general, we find support for the place stratification perspective over the public good view of the public transportation network. Now, none of this is to say that public transportation is bad. I would not make that argument. However, what this seems to imply is that the public benefit of the public transportation network does not seem to be uniformly experienced, such that Black and Latino neighborhoods appear to be less able to take advantage of this, or rather that the same system connects them to fewer jobs. So the planning community needs to account for how this good may be more uniformly experienced in order to flatten income differences across areas. But that's our study. We're preparing this for review right now, so any questions or comments that you have would be great. We're all sociologists pretending to be geographers for the day, so any insight from our geography friends would be helpful. You can also contact me here if you think of something after the fact. Anyway, thank you for your attention, and I hope that you all are doing well in these difficult times. Thank you.